Anyone who has recently seen photos from the Nanjing exhibitions has surely been reminded of a chapter in history that can never be forgotten. Even today, 80 years later, no Chinese person with a conscience can easily forgive the crimes Japan committed during World War II. But a deeper analysis reveals that the reason China and Japan cannot escape the shadow of this history is not that the Japanese are inherently evil, nor is it because the Chinese are unforgiving. The true underlying cause of all the problems between China and Japan is the United States' leniency toward Japanese war criminals during the establishment of the Cold War order, combined with a series of decisions made by the Kuomintang, or the KMT regime in Taiwan. It is an undeniable fact that the invading Japanese army in China, both in terms of the scale and nature of their actions, were among the most prolific perpetrators of war crimes in the history of modern warfare. Beyond the infamous Nanjing massacre, the war crimes committed by the Japanese military in the Chinese theater alone include, but are not limited to, widespread violation of the Geneva Conventions, including the abuse, enslavement, and mass execution of Chinese prisoners of war, the large-scale and frequent use of chemical weapons, waging biological warfare in multiple regions of China by spreading pathogens like plague and cholera, causing massive civilian casualties, establishing the secret biological warfare research group Unit 731 to conduct extremely cruel human experiments, implementing the three alls policy, kill all, burn all, loot all, to create no man's lands through the organized and systematic mass slaughter of civilians, forcibly conscripting hundreds of thousands of Chinese women to serve as comfort women for the Japanese army. Because the crimes committed by the invading Japanese army in China were too numerous to count, the demand for Japan's unconditional surrender and the severe punishment of its war criminals, as stipulated in the Cairo and Potsdam Declarations, became the only path to justice. When Japan announced its unconditional surrender in August 1945, it not only agreed to accept severe legal sanctions against its war criminals from the Allied powers, but also forfeited any right to bargain. In theory, China, as a victor, could have imposed any form of punishment on Japan. In fact, imposing rational punishment at that time was the best opportunity to permanently end the animosity between the two nations. To understand how Japan could have been punished, we only need to look at the standard answer provided by the Soviet Union in its treatment of Germany. After accepting Germany's unconditional surrender and controlling a large part of its eastern territory, the Soviets first exacted war reparations by dismantling and relocating a vast amount of German industry. They then partitioned eastern Germany, ceding traditional German territories like Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia to Poland and the Soviet Union itself. At the same time, millions of ethnic Germans were forcibly expelled from these former German lands. The Soviets took the policy of keeping the land but not the people to its extreme. Finally, the USSR conducted an incredibly thorough denazification of Germany's mid- to high-level officials. Beyond punishing numerous war criminals, over 520,000 former Nazi Party members in East Germany alone were permanently removed from public office. This series of actions effectively settled the historical debts between the Russian and German peoples at the time. To this day, even when Germany and Russia are at odds over EU policy, there is virtually no dispute at the public level between them regarding World War II history, and cultural exchange is extensive. So why couldn't China and Japan settle their debts in the same way? The problem wasn't a lack of a plan, but that the plan was never implemented, and the one that was deeply flawed. In the final stages of World War II, and immediately after,
The anti-fascist allies did have a clear plan to occupy Japan by dividing it into zones. Japan was to be partitioned from north to south and occupied separately by the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and China. To facilitate this, Britain even formed a British Commonwealth occupation force. Had this plan been executed, the punishment Japan received would have likely been comparable to the Soviets' punishment of Germany. Two factors caused this plan to be scrapped. First, Germany surrendered before Japan did. By mid-1945, the U.S. and its European allies had already witnessed the Soviet Union's occupation tactics in eastern Germany. To prevent northern Japan from becoming another Soviet bridgehead, the U.S. ultimately chose to end the war with atomic bombs, thereby blocking a Soviet entry into Japan. The four-way partition plan was thus reduced to a three-way one. The second factor was the emergence of a familiar figure who blocked this new partition plan. As many know, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, Douglas MacArthur, was a man with an immense appetite for power. Upon learning that the Soviets would not be entering Japan, he staunchly opposed any form of zoned occupation. His official reason was that it would create a chaotic Allied command structure. But his core motive was to prevent any dilution of his absolute authority in Japan. At the time, both Britain and the Republic of China were exhausted by the war and dependent on American aid, so they acquiesced to MacArthur's demands. As a result, in 1945, the General Headquarters, led by MacArthur, assumed direct control over a fully intact Japan, whose homeland had suffered almost no damage. The decision not to partition Japan guaranteed that it would not face fundamental punishment after the war. MacArthur's subsequent policies further served to whitewash Japan's past.
Initially, even without partitioning the country, the U.S. occupation forces under MacArthur drafted a harsh penalty plan for Japan. This plan aimed to eradicate Japan's militarist superstructure, destroy its war economy, and reform the very fabric of its society. At the operational level, there was even a proposal, the Pauli Report, to dismantle Japan's industrial facilities and distribute them as reparations to the Asian nations it had invaded. However, even this punitive plan was never effectively executed. In the first few years after the war, the U.S. did impose some punishments. The Allies conducted the Tokyo trials, sending Hideki Tojo and other Class A war criminals to the gallows. Approximately 210,000 figures from Japan's old political, military, and financial guard were purged from public life. But the United States was not the primary victim of Japan's fascist aggression, and these punishments felt feeble and were carried out with extreme slowness. More fatally, the entire series of punishments was a function of American foreign policy. When the external environment changed, U.S. policy toward Japan reversed almost overnight. After the First Berlin crisis erupted, the United States came to see the Soviet Union as the #1 threat to its hegemony. In mid-1948, it immediately shifted Japan's status from a perpetrator to be punished to a strategic asset to be cultivated. The U.S. not only halted new war crimes trials, but also began a large-scale rehabilitation of the purged old guard. Nearly all the militarists who had been removed from public office had their political restrictions lifted, allowing them to freely return to Japanese politics and business. Even Nobusuke Kishi, a Class A war criminal and the grandfather of Shinzo Abe, who was still in prison in late 1948, was released by the Americans. Even more seriously, to further control Japan, the U.S. not only freed these militarists, but actively began supporting right-wing forces represented by figures like Shigeru Yoshida and Nobusuke Kishi, directly elevating them to the position of prime minister. The message the U.S. was sending to the Japanese was clear: cooperate with us and your guilt will be erased. To groom Japan for its new role, the U.S. formally terminated the Industrial Dismantling and Reparations Plan in May 1949, and even began providing Japan with economic aid to spur its recovery. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 was the final catalyst. The U.S. used Japan as its rear supply base, and a flood of special procurement orders revived Japanese factories. In a grim twist of irony, this transformed Japan from a nation meant to be punished into a beneficiary of war, profiting handsomely. This created a deeply toxic cycle in Japan, a nation that, under conditional surrender, implying an admission of guilt, was now seeing its war criminals granted legitimacy by a shift in U.S. policy. The return of these criminals to power inevitably led to a reinterpretation of history.
Adding fuel to the fire, the KMT regime, which had retreated to Taiwan and was desperate for American aid, made numerous decisions that favored Japan and deeply hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. In 1952, the Taiwan authorities signed the illegitimate Sino-Japanese peace treaty, in which they announced the renunciation of any claim to war reparations from Japan. This directly constrained the diplomatic options for the new government of the People's Republic of China, which in 1972 was also compelled to announce it would forgo reparations. Furthermore, to serve its anti-communist objectives, the KMT regime pardoned a large number of Japanese war criminals. A representative case occurred in January 1949, when a KMT military tribunal in Shanghai, under direct orders from Chiang Kai-shek, acquitted and released General Yasuji Okamura. Even worse, between 1950 and 1969, the KMT government, blurring the line between friend and foe, secretly hired approximately 83 former Japanese military officers, led by Naosumi Tomita, to provide military training and consultation to its forces in Taiwan. During an era when the Taiwan authorities illegally occupied China's seat at the United Nations, these actions were tantamount to forgiving Japan on behalf of the deeply wronged Chinese people. This, in effect, gave a green light to right-wing politicians in Japan to begin whitewashing history. And so, following a rehabilitation by the U.S. that was more reward than punishment, and an illegitimate forgiveness from the KMT authorities in Taiwan, the right-wing elements who returned to power in Japan began to invent history on a grand scale. They revised historical terminology in textbooks, downplayed the atrocities of the Japanese army, and paid respects at the Yasukuni Shrine to venerate their ancestors. This series of actions naturally enrages any victim of Japanese militarism. The unresolved hatred between China and Japan can only be truly settled through a future thorough reckoning with Japan's right-wing elements. And the prerequisite for that reckoning lies not in Japan, but in the United States.